time, so a very brief answer if you're able to, please.
Well, I was going to start on the COVID question. We spent every dime that the federal government gave to us went toward COVID, and as did other provinces, I assume. But we also added to that where it was needed. But I would also point out we had one of the best records on COVID in the country, working with our colleagues at Atlantic Canada. So
are you able to?
Thank you, gentlemen, both. Sorry, we are out of time. Mr. Savard Tremblay, please go ahead and ignore what Dr. Ellis says. I think your jacket is perfect.
Well, I didn't hear any disparaging comments about my jacket. I'd like us to revisit the minutes after this meeting. But Mr. Premier Higgs, tell me, you said earlier concerning funding that you'd like to see greater funding for Anglophone school boards. How is that an issue with allocations from the federal government? Why isn't the onus on you to change your education system and funding thereof?
Yeah, I'm sorry if that was the what you got from my message. It is a provincial responsibility, and what my point was is I would like to see a greater results from our schools, greater results in our ability for kids to speak both languages. We are a bilingual province after all, but our performance really hasn't improved in that regard much in the 50 years of trying to learn a second language. Our education in the English schools, about 30% graduate being bilingual, 70% don't. So you'd say if we were a bilingual province, how could that be our record after 50 years? And then the challenge too, we know we have the challenges in literacy and numeracy, and so that's an ongoing challenge, as well as other activities in the school that we're just trying to manage. We know that teachers are going to make the difference in all that, and finding a way for teachers' voices to be heard is a solution. So that was my point earlier. If that wasn't clear, that's what I was trying to put across.
Thank you. Now tell me, I'm curious, just to clarify, the 65 cents on the litre, where did you come up with that figure? That means that each litre of gas would amount to 1% of a tonne of gas. So a big vehicle that filled up its tank would emit a tonne? Is that what you're asserting there?
About 10 seconds to respond, Premier Higgs.
So the point is, and on the fill up. So going where we are, it just keeps adding up. And right today, the 23%, would make a difference in cars that would be 20 to say a new car filling up right now would be $10 more on a 50 liter of gas. Looking at where this is headed by 2030, bigger vehicles $600, a minivan $450, an SUV $420, and a sedan $400. So the point of the 62 cents is that at 37.5 will be carbon tax, 17 cents will be clean fuel standards, and there's 8 cents on that that's an HST, which gives you 63 cents
thank
by
you,
2030.
Premier Higgs. We are just trying to keep to our schedule so we can get you out on time. Back to you, Mr. Bachrach, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Premier Higgs, you've talked at length about this idea of selling gas to Europe as part of Canada's contribution to global climate change. I'm wondering about the business case for New Brunswick specifically. You're talking about building massive amounts of infrastructure, shipping the gas across the ocean, and selling it to European countries. Are those European markets that you're hoping to sell New Brunswick LNG to, are they projected to have increasing demand for such gas?
Yes, they are indeed. We have a couple MOUs. We've had different countries that have asked us, could we would sign a 20-year agreement for supply. And so there's no shortage of demand. And when I was in Europe, they said that we can't believe Canada's not providing any energy solution for our needs here. And the point of us building, you'd say the infrastructure, we already have an LNG plant here in Eastern Canada. It's an LNG import. It can be converted to an LNG export for around $2 to $3 billion. And Repsol were prepared to do that, but they need a gas supply. We have gas in the province. We have pipelines that are already connecting this gas supply. So it's a matter of developing them and utilizing, We all need to be on side. First Nations need to be part of this for sure. But in a moderate, very moderate expansion, on the First Nations communities in New Brunswick, it could have an impact of anywhere between 800 million and 1.6 billion. And that's just on a very modest expansion of wells that are already in place in the southern part of the province, southwestern.
But thinking long-term, Premier, is the analysis that you're getting showing that there is increasing demand for gas in those European markets?
Yes, it's showing that the absolutely hydrogen is 50, before it's any impact.
No, not hydrogen,
I know,
natural gas.
But my point is there isn't an alternative. That was where I was going with that. There isn't an alternative.
Okay, just back to my original question, because you said, yes, you have analysis that shows that there's increasing demand for natural gas in European markets. Can you table that analysis with the committee?
So let's put it this way. Let's put the facts. I could sign tomorrow a 20-year agreement with a country in Europe for gas supply.
And which country is that?
Czech Republic was one. We've had others that have. When I was there was the Czech Republic. We've had others that have shown interest, and other countries like U.S. are building. Germany's another because they've built a lot of LNG import facilities. They are building this infrastructure, and they did it in record time. If you looked at the stats, you'd see they put these up in months.
I apologize, Premier. That is our time. We'll have to move on to our last two rounds. Our last two interventions will be 5-minute interventions. We have Mr. Halan, and then it will be Mr. Kuzmierczuk. Go ahead, Mr. Halan.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Premier Higgs, for being here. You've joined 70% of Canadians and 6 other premiers, including a Liberal Premier, Andrew Furey, to call on this Liberal NDP government to spike the hike on April the 1st that will raise the carbon tax 23%, making the cost of everything more expensive. Can you please explain to this committee why you're calling on this and why it's so important to spike the hike?
Well, it's like putting a needle in. I guess you keep doing a little bit at a time, and you think, well, it doesn't hurt that bad, so I can stand it. And then all of a sudden, you look back and you say, I've added 60 cents a liter to gas. At what point do you bring this thing to reality? So, the analysis done earlier said, well, it's only going to be 60 cents on a fill-up. Well, currently, with the 17.6 cents, and where we are right now, it relies to an extra $10 on the total carbon tax to date. But then you keep moving that along to the 60 cents, it becomes more and more relevant. So you're at some point, you bring it up and say, okay, when are we going to realize that this is a punitive tax, not achieving the big picture results, and we think we're saving the world on climate change? And that's the point. We are causing negative impact on every citizen. So you can argue with me, or you can look at across the country and see 7 provinces that are saying this is a problem. And you can say, well, what can we do about it? And 7 provinces that are represented by, different parties, that this is a problem. So at some point, you'd like to think there would be an ear to hear this and say, all right, yeah, we're getting deeper now. It's costing more now. It's not just about another 3 cents in April. It's about all of the cumulative effect of increased cost of energy, and particularly in provinces that have no other alternative.
The PBO once again reiterated yesterday that the carbon tax has a net negative impact on families. Can you talk a little bit more to the negative impact it's playing on families in New Brunswick?
Well, to me, the issue becomes calculating the full spectrum of what it means to have our energy costs. We've seen costs go up in every sector, and the grocery stores particularly that have gone up, in building supplies gone up. And so our inflationary costs have gone up. So we're seeing a little change in inflation rates, so let's hope that continues to drop. In New Brunswick, we've seen assessments go up dramatically, but we've had a population growth here for the first time in many years, so it's had an impact. But the cost of housing is preventing more houses being built, and so people just look and say, well, is the government going to come up with a solution here to solve the problem? Well, let's focus on the problem. Let's get back to the policies that are creating a problem, or certainly having a major impact on making it worse, rather than try to pretend we should put Band-Aids on in order to mitigate just a poor policy.
This Liberal NDP government consistently says Canada is the problem. Premier Higgs, can you please let this Liberal NDP government know how Canada can be the solution and why it's not the problem?
Yes, I did. And what I was saying earlier is about what we're seeing in BC and Alberta with export of energy and natural gas. What we can do on the East Coast is the very same thing: is export with natural gas and LNG. And the issue is that is a climate action that mitigates the affordability challenge, because the revenue would be used both for offsetting costs for people in the province, and it would be used for technology development. When we develop the technology, people are going to be more acute, more astute about how they can manage and reduce their emissions. You know, we talk about the electric cars. We're not able to cope with electric car productions or the battery productions to meet the requirements for 2035. And so the point is, let's have a realistic plan to transition through this time period, but let's use our resources to pay for it rather than everybody's home, everybody's pocket. Let the resources pay for the change that we all know we must.
Thank you, Premier. My last question is, the Governor of the Bank of Canada clearly stated that 0.6 of the overall inflation number in Canada today is contributed by this carbon tax scam. 0.6, and if we got rid of it, it would put a massive dent in inflation that might help to lower the interest rates faster. After we've seen this government double the cost of mortgages and houses and rents. Can you please tell us how important it is to axe this tax on housing?
Well, I think that
Very brief.
It's very important. I mean, to look at all these taxes that are being put on buildings, on the issues of fuel, or the issues of commodities, it all flows into higher costs. So I think that we just need to rethink our program and what we can do in the world to have the greatest impact.
Thank you, Premier Higgs. Mr. Kusmirchuk for 5, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much, Premier, for being here with us here today and for answering our questions and shedding light on your plan and New Brunswick's plan for to address climate change. I find it interesting that yesterday and today we will have 3 premiers testifying here before us. 3 premiers that over the last 4 years have all dealt with record-setting forest fires. And you look at, for example, Saskatchewan, for example, saw 494 fires and about 2 million hectares that were burnt last year in Saskatchewan. And obviously we heard from the Premier yesterday. Alberta last year had 2.2 million hectares burnt in Alberta. It was the greatest forest fires that province has seen, 1,121 wildfires that claimed 2.2 million hectares that were burnt. City of Edmonton had recorded 299 smoke hours last year. So the residents of Edmonton had to deal with 299 smoke hours, again, a record far and away. And of course, your own province has seen record forest fires in 2020. Premier, what is your plan? What is your climate plan?
So, you know, once again, my climate plan is to have a bigger impact on world emissions. I think it sounds like here that many of you are going to be surprised if we reach our 1.8% target and those conditions you just outlined are better. Because
Premier Higgs, what is your plan for New Brunswick? What is I understand you've got a global plan. What is your plan for New Brunswick?
We continue to reduce. We're well ahead of targets in New Brunswick for emission reduction. Well ahead of targets. And we continue to push in that direction to meet the targets that are put forward. So that's the plan. When you want to talk about, so that is on target. In relation to forest fire, I do want to point out something. So forest industry is hugely, it's a big issue for New Brunswick. We're #1 in Canada for forest products on a GDP per capita. Our 900 companies directly in the forestry sector, 24,000 full-time jobs. Now, the reason I'm saying all that is not only to identify the economic benefit, but to identify the benefit of managing forests. in many cases, the reasons that forests we have climate change, we have drier conditions. No one is denying any of that. But when you let old forests...
Premier, I do apologize, but I'm not hearing a plan here. I'm just hearing words here. And Mr. Chair, I am going to share my time with my colleague, Ms. Satwin, as well, too. And so I'll just pass my questions over to her.
Thanks, Ms. Satwin. You have 2 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Kuzmarczyk. And Premier Higgs, we'll just kind of pick up on a piece you mentioned about the forestry sector, for example. I know that we have sustained use of aerial spraying of glyphosate in the province, which has actually created a monoculture in our forestry sector, which could actually lead to more susceptible conditions for forest fires. So to point to that as kind of a big piece of that plan is concerning to me. You also mentioned, Indigenous communities and the potential for, natural gas exploration. I would remind you that there was significant demonstrations and protests across the country or across the province during that time because it wasn't something that Indigenous communities wanted in their backyard. So has that relationship changed at all? I'd like some insight on that piece.
I would think the reality is starting to set in that this is a huge economic benefit. It's done across the country, particularly in BC and in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But the idea that the development of natural gas is not new. It's well established. The impact it can have in world emissions, it's well established. And yes, I'd like to think the First Nations are learning more about this so they understand economically and environmentally what it can mean. So that is the process that is underway. But we could certainly make an impact with the federal government being part of that. But I want to go back to the forestry comment and the glyphosate. The biggest use of glyphosate is in farming and agriculture.
But we're talking about forestry sector.
Yeah. Well, you can't isolate one without the other. It might be easier to talk about forestry right now, but the whole point
aerial spraying
is mostly in agriculture and in the forestry sector. I want to point out the fact that...
Does it not create monocultures, though, that make our forests more susceptible to forest fires?
Having...
And threaten biodiversity, which should be part of any climate plan?
Let me answer. It was my question, was it not?
Well, it's my time, actually, sir.
All right, your time and my answer then.
Sure,
please,
I'd like the answer to that.
The idea is that we have the lowest loss in Canada for land lost by fire. And that is, we're number one in Canada for forest products. I said that, but we are also recognized leader in forest fire protection. And the reason for that is because we have not only a quick attack unit in order to mitigate their loss.
Sorry, Premier, I need to wrap up, please.
Okay. But we have actually an active forest management system and harvesting. Old forests are not being allowed just to rot and become fire traps.
Thank you very much. That is our time. Premier Higgs, thank you very much. We will suspend for a few minutes to bring in our next witness.
Thanks, everyone.
Is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the committee, especially knowing that it's constituency week. So thank you for taking the time for that. I know how important that is to you. I'm here on behalf of Albertans and Canadians who are struggling with severe financial pressures. They're increasingly desperate because they're facing a cost of living crisis not seen in decades. Over the last 2 years, inflation and high interest rates have driven up prices on everything from food to gas to housing, things that Albertans rely on every single day. Families are being forced to make tough choices just to put food on the table. Businesses are having to make sacrifices to keep the lights on. Social services are under intense strain as more and more people reach out for help, many for the first time in their lives. Albertans and all Canadians need common sense, compassion, and responsible government to prevail. That's why I'm urging you today to heed the calls of Canadians across the country and suspend the increase in the carbon tax on April 1st. The carbon tax has contributed to and worsened Canadian stress and financial pain. Despite the federal government's claims that Canadians benefit from rebates, the carbon tax on a net basis will cost Albertans more than $900 this year if the tax is implemented. The federal government's own parliamentary budget officer has also said that the cost to each Albertan will more than triple in the next 6 years to a staggering expense of $2,700 net by 2030 to 2031. This isn't just reckless, it's immoral, and it's inhumane. And the added pressure will ruin countless lives, futures, and dreams. It's a weight that Canadians can't bear. And that's why Alberta has been calling on the federal government to eliminate the carbon tax since 2019. Let me repeat what I've said many times before. We understand the importance of achieving carbon neutrality, and we can manage it together as a nation without punishing everyday Albertans. We've demonstrated as much in Alberta, where we are making significant strides towards reducing emissions. And we're doing it without compromising jobs and hurting the industries that have created so much wealth and prosperity for our country, and which will continue to do so if the federal government would just let them. Our province has a long history of climate action, with more than 2 decades of programs and policies that have led emissions reductions and inspired other jurisdictions to follow our lead. Provinces and territories must be able to create emissions reduction plans that reflect their distinct needs and priorities. Alberta's industries are steadily lowering emissions with new technology and investment, even as they compete with foreign suppliers who ignore the need to improve their own performance. And things don't have to be this way. We can effectively reduce emissions without punishing Canadians for trying to stay warm or drive to work or school or a medical appointment. Alberta's already doing it through our carbon trading market. It's the technology innovation and emissions reduction regulation, just launched actually on NGX this month, and through our emissions reduction and energy development plan, which I released last April. The only thing the federal carbon tax is achieving is higher costs. And in fact, Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault did say it would take until 2060 for it to have an impact. As of April 1st, Albertans will pay around 35 cents in federal taxes for every liter of fuel, along with the carbon tax that also includes the federal excise tax and the GST, which is a tax on tax. The price of natural gas, which Albertans rely on, will also be affected by the carbon tax increase. The carbon tax increase on natural gas is going up to $4.09 a gigajoule, which is more than double the base price of natural gas, which today stands at about $1.72 a gigajoule. The so-called solutions the federal government is to increase the carbon tax on something that is life or death for Albertans in the extreme cold of winter. And I will say that is, again, inhumane. It begs the question, how far will the federal government go to make life even more difficult and expensive when so many Canadians are already struggling? Alberta municipalities, schools, and healthcare providers are telling us that they need to make cuts and borrow from elsewhere in their budgets just to accommodate the upcoming carbon tax increase. And yet we hear repeatedly that affordability remains a top federal priority. So I'm calling on the federal government to match words with actions. This means working with the provinces to ease Canadians' burdens and strengthen the Canadian economy. Serious challenges like affordability and emissions demand serious responses, and an increased federal carbon tax is nothing of the sort. And Canadians don't want it. You only need to look across the country to see premiers across party lines, 7 of us, and the people they represent stand up against it. If the federal government wants to protect Canadians' quality of life, it should step up and cancel the carbon tax increase immediately. At the very least, the federal government should apply policy equally across the country. We've heard the Quebec representative say several times that Quebec does not pay the fuel tax. And we also would like to see an exemption on all forms of home heating, not just ones that are centered in Atlantic Canada and on a particular type of fuel. It must do this for the sake of fairness for all Canadians. The people of this country deserve nothing less. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Premier Smith. We'll start with Mr. Halland. Before we do, though, just to keep on time and respect the Premier's time, we're going to stay exact to our timing. I will cut off on them right on the 6 and 5 minute mark, so please watch your time. Mr. Halland, go ahead, please.
I'll just start off by saying how I feel it's very shameful for the finance chair, Peter Fonseca, that went into hiding as soon as the premiers came calling to call a meeting on their request. Premier, thank you for being here, and thank you for joining 70% of Canadians and 6 other premiers, including a Liberal premier, in telling this Liberal NDP government to spike the hike on the road to axing the tax by a common-sense Conservative government. The PBO once again reconfirmed that families are at a net loss on average because of this carbon tax scam. For example, in Alberta, a family will pay $2,900 into this carbon tax scam, and according to the finance minister herself, she said that families, and she was bragging that Alberta families get $1,800 in rebates, and that somehow Albertans should be grateful for this. Premier, can you please tell Canadians the human toll that this carbon tax scam puts on Albertan families so that the Liberals can understand the real pain it causes?
Well, I can tell you a couple of things. The way I think most Albertans look at it is the government is taking $1 and promising to give back 75 cents. And everybody knows that that's not a good deal. We've seen in the polling that people don't support the increase. They don't support the tax. And I can tell you an MNP report from October 2023 showed that 51% of Canadians are $200 or less away from being unable to meet their financial obligations. We also find that in Alberta, people are more likely to say that their level of debt is concerning to them, 51%, and that they are worried about their ability to repay their debts, 71%. So we took a number of affordability measures in order to be able to offset these costs over the last number of years. Foregone revenue of $7 billion. In fact, I'd be happy to itemize it if the member would like to ask me about it. But we are now at a point where we have to run a balanced budget as well. And we're just asking for the federal government to recognize that it's their turn to do their part to ease the affordability crisis.
Thank you, Premier. As you mentioned, in Atlantic Canada, when their Liberal MPs were revolting because their poll numbers were tanking, Atlantic Canada got a carve-out. Alberta got no such carve-out, just like the rest of Canada. Do you feel this is just another blatant attack on Alberta?
Look, I know that the question has been raised about the Supreme Court decision on the carbon tax, and I believe that the Supreme Court decided in favor of the government on that because they were making the argument that it was such an important national issue, it needed to be dealt with in a national way, and the rules needed to apply equally across the country. And yet we've heard the Quebec members say that they don't pay a carbon tax. We have heard as well that in Atlantic Canada, the most polluting home heating fuel, in fact, which is home heating oil, now has a reprieve for 3 years. Meanwhile, many of the provinces in the West made the decision years ago to switch to cleaner burning natural gas, and we're getting punished for it. So I would just appeal to this committee that if you want to apply the carbon tax, it has to be applied equally across the country in all provinces for all types of fuel. And if you're not going to apply it that way, then you need to give a reprieve across the country so that everybody is treated fairly. I think it's creating a national unity crisis, and I do believe that it's the obligation of the members around this table representing all parties to ensure fairness in the way each citizen is treated in the country if they have the mandate to do so.
Chair, I'm just going to raise a point of order. And
Sure.
I just
Go ahead, Mr.
My sincere
Naqvi.
apologies to the Premier. I don't want to be disrespectful. I think yesterday I see Mr. Halland has a prop on his computer. Yesterday you deemed that to be a prop, so I would just suggest that if he can not display that while he's on the screen, I'll appreciate it because that's.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can't see from the angle I'm at, but, oh, yes. Mr. Naqvi has a point, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you, sir.
Too bad the Liberals are triggered by by a sticker once again. Premier, when you talk about national unity crisis, I think of Stephen Guilbeault, who, as far as I know, is the only minister that has been in handcuffs and in an orange jumpsuit. Can you please speak a little bit about how dangerous his ideology is when it comes to our clean, responsible, low-carbon energy sector for Alberta and Canada's prosperity?
I should just make sure the committee knows exactly why Stephen Guilbeault faced law problems. One was for the stunt he pulled on the CN Tower. The other was that he climbed on the roof of our Premier, Ralph Klein, when his wife Colleen was home, terrifying her. So you can imagine how Albertans feel that this is the person now responsible for enacting emissions policy. I would say that we've been able to work constructively with the federal government on a number of areas. They have worked with us on establishing a net zero petrochemical plant with Dow Chemical, a net zero hydrogen plant with Air Products. We're in the process of getting to the final finish line on a net zero cement plant with Heidelberg. They've worked with us on de Havilland to make sure that we've got water bombers being built, not only in our province, but will also help the rest of the country. So I don't want to say that it's uniformly negative, but the spirit of cooperative federalism means that you do not take unilateral action in an area of provincial jurisdiction. It means that you work collaboratively, and I think the court has chastised the federal government, led by, in this area, Stephen Guilbeault, on 2 occasions for that, the Impact Assessment Act as well as the plastics ban. The approach that I would like to see them take is to work collaboratively with us the way we have, not come through with a cap on a particular industry, oil and gas emissions, which they have announced, or a cap on methane, which they have announced, which will disproportionately impact our province. Their proposal for a net zero power grid outside the Constitution under Section 92 and clearly demonstrates they don't understand how our electricity market works. Net zero vehicles, having 20% vehicles being sold by 2026, we know that that will simply kill our auto sector
Premier,
and reduce our ability.
I apologize. I have to ask you to wrap up.
Of course, those are just some examples, and not to mention that the minister doesn't seem to want to build roads. It's like he hasn't ever left downtown Montreal. It's a big country.
Thank you very much, Premier. Thank you, Mr. Helland. Mr. Sousa, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and Premier, appreciate you being here, and I apologize for those earlier points of order. As you can appreciate, a Conservative chair brought you here without consultation of this committee to talk about main estimates, but now we're talking about something else completely different, which is meant for the Finance Committee. And yesterday we put forward a motion, the last motion, which the Conservative chair did not allow us to pass. He adjourned, which made it very clear what the will of the committee was, notwithstanding the misinterpretation of an earlier motion. So I just wanted to preface that by saying to you that we appreciate you being here, but we also recognize the politics involved and the partisanship that's taking place. And can you advise us, when were you contacted to appear before this committee?
Sure, I was contacted. We wrote a letter on March the 26th asking to appear before the Finance Committee.
No, the OGGO committee. When were you approached to approach
correct.
OGGO?
After we'd written our letter, we were approached on the same day, March the 26th, to appear before the committee.
Thank you for that. Another item is the notion of reducing emissions in Canada, reducing emissions across all provinces, trying to make Canada competitive. You reaffirm very eloquently the initiatives that are being taken, not just in the province of Alberta, but everywhere, in respect to trying to be innovative, the green economy, to do things concurrently. We are still a big oil and gas country. We still net a lot of revenue and recognize the importance of that export. We also recognize the importance of making it cleaner where possible to get it through. And those are important initiatives. I worked out in Calgary for many years in the early 80s, as did many of those from out east, to work out west. And I appreciate the industry. However, for our kids' sake, for your sake, for all of our sake, we want to make Canada even better, notwithstanding. And in Ontario, where I had the privilege of representing for some months, years, I should say, as Minister of Finance, we also brought in the cap and trade system. Similar to Quebec, we're part of the Western Climate Initiative to be exempt from the federal alternative, to be competitive and reinvest dollar for dollar into innovative industries while, again, being competitive. We have cement plants. We have a lot of things. As to you in Alberta, and you do trade. You've talked about some of the credits that you take advantage of. And Ontario was netting $1.5 billion or so in net earnings to be reinvested. And then a conservative government came in and did away with that to pick a fight with Justin Trudeau, the premier or the prime minister, on carbon tax when it was unnecessary. And here we have an opportunity to do things. I need to understand the incentive now that Alberta's been taking to innovate and bring forward all of these great reductions to emissions. Why are you doing that?
Well, I should say that we showed leadership back in 2007 by setting the first price on carbon, I believe, in North America. And we've continued with our industrial carbon pricing ever since. It's been renamed to the Technology, Innovation, and Emissions Reduction program. And the way it works is that industry is expected to be able to meet a certain standard. If they are above that standard, they pay into the fund. And then we use the fund to be able to reduce emissions elsewhere. So since 2009, we have seen over $2 billion invested through Emissions Reduction Alberta.
Yeah, those are fantastic. Why not expand it further? Like, why did you not take it a step further? Because we all recognize the importance of pricing carbon. Do you believe pollution should be free?
We have taken it further. We have asked for a recognition from ECCC to be able to acknowledge our tier program as being equivalent, and they did until 2030. And so we part of the way we did that is that we matched our increases with the federal increases. So by 2030, it'll go up to $170 on industrial emissions. We're talking today about retail emissions, and I look at those as being two totally different things.
And I understand. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Sorry.
It's my time.
I also just want to say we also expanded it to include more. We included anyone under 2,000. My apologies.
No, I appreciate what you're saying. And we do offer rebates as a result of the consumer spending so that they get more than they receive. About 8 out of 10 families get that benefit. On another note, in Ontario, we also were looking at providing a Ontario pension plan to supplement the Canada pension plan, to add to it. And the whole intent was to enhance CPP to make it even stronger. It's also a matter of unity. It's a matter of protecting all Canadians. You spoke at the start of talking about Albertans and Canadians for the nation's benefit. Can you explain what benefit there is to Albertans by withdrawing from CPP, creating more costs, and putting at risk their retirement?
Well, there is a formula in the Act that was insisted upon by Ontario so that if Ontario ever wanted to get out of the Canada pension plan, there would be clear rules for how to do that. We applied that methodology and found that every year Albertans pay more in premiums than they get back in benefits with that invested over time. It has grown to about $334 billion that we would be entitled to based on the formula in the Act. I think it's important for all Albertans to know and also all Canadians to know just how unbalanced Confederation is, just how much Alberta does pay into Confederation.
When Ontario was a so-called have-not province, it still provided $11 billion more to the rest of the Federation than it received, whereas other provinces, and that has happened with Alberta, but it's a national unity issue. It's about protecting Canadians. It's also about protecting Albertans for their future retirement. Before I let you go, can you document the times that you were called upon to come to this committee so that we can have that report back as well?
Certainly. It was just the one time, and we said yes immediately.
Thanks. That is our time. Mr. Savard Tremblay, please, for 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson and Premier. Good afternoon or good morning. Thank you for your presentation. When it comes to overall federal spending, well, oftentimes there's encroachment, tramping on provincial areas of jurisdiction.
Translation setting on my end. My apologies.
Sorry, Mr. Savard Tremblay. We'll pause the time and check for interpretation.
Testing one. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is the English channel.
There's a little globe icon.
There might be a little globe button at the bottom for interpretation, bottom of your screen for Zoom.
Original audio English. Listen in English.
Perfect.
Let me just see if that works. Sorry, I'm new to the simultaneous translation. I hope that works.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
State your time and start again, Mr. Tremblay, or Savard Tremblay, please.
Oui. Alors, vous me permettez de recommencer.
If I may start from scratch, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Well, good morning, Premier, and thank you for your presentation. When it comes to federal spending, there's often encroachment and trampling on provincial areas of jurisdiction. You enacted an Alberta Sovereignty Act. And as a member of the Bloc Québécois, I'm quite sympathetic to that notion. I'm fighting for the complete independence of my nation, and I want to know what motivated you. What was the root cause of this? Is it because the Constitution was being flouted? Was the spending encroaching on your areas of jurisdiction? What kind of interference prompted you to do this?
Mostly it's been the various legal actions we've had to take against the federal government. We've had a victory on the Impact Assessment Act, which you know is Bill C-69. We had a success initially on the declaration of plastics being toxic, also deemed to be unconstitutional. But I can tell you my Justice Department is very busy. We have about 14 different actions that we are going to be taking against the federal government for various ways in which they're interfering with our jurisdiction. If you read the Alberta Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act, so I don't share your aspiration on separation, we just believe that the Constitution should be abided, that the Constitution was written in a way that gives sovereign powers to the provincial levels of government and sovereign powers to the federal levels of government, and talks about the need for cooperative federalism, that the federal government cannot interfere in an area of provincial jurisdiction unilaterally. And I think that's being borne out with some of the court decisions they've now lost.
Parfait, je vous remercie.
Thank you. Sorry about the lag. It's so that I can hear the interpretation. Well, listen, I know that we don't necessarily share the same aspirations. We didn't sign the Constitution in Quebec. At the very least, we'd like it to be upheld. That would be at least something. But the fact is that we would like the Constitution to be upheld and that there be no encroachments that fly in the face of the Constitution. Now, as far as federal spending is concerned, there are oftentimes programs that involve encroachment, and in the last budget there are new taxes that are again a trampling on provincial jurisdiction. Sometimes programs are introduced which on the surface ostensibly aren't encroachment on provincial areas of jurisdiction but open the door to such meddling. Do you have misgivings about that kind of approach?
We certainly do, and in one way we've been inspired by Quebec, by your premier, in some of the policies that he has established to establish guardrails around provincial jurisdiction. In particular, one of the things we like to emulate is that if there is an area of federal encroachment using the spending power, we've observed that Quebec has particular success at being able to opt out and be able to receive the full compensation. And that is a strategy that we have started to employ and will continue to do that.
Donc, vous souhaitez, si je puis me permettre.
So, if I could paraphrase you, you would like more power for Alberta, more areas of jurisdiction, and if so, which, please?
We would certainly like for our full area of constitutional jurisdiction to be respected. I recognize that the federal government's responsible for military, for international trade agreements, for international agreements, even like those signed at the COP meetings, for passports, for immigration, for currency. There are some areas that are concurrent that we would like to be able to collaborate on, like immigration, but I don't have any interest on encroaching on any of those areas. In fact, if I tried to set up my own currency or establish my own passport office, then people would say, that's crazy, that's federal jurisdiction. I think people should say exactly the same thing when the federal government encroaches on our jurisdiction. They should say, you can't do that. The Constitution doesn't allow it. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that it works both ways, and we're trying to assert that it should.
Ceci dit, Madame Smith, je pourrais vous dire.
Well, were passports to be within your purview, well, obviously the results wouldn't be worse than we've seen in Ottawa in recent times. But that said, it's my understanding that Quebec's model is one that you may wish to emulate. I know that previously there were individuals such as Stephen Harper who wrote a letter stating that Quebec was his role model, and that in Alberta you'd like the same kind of framework. So it's an inspiration for you, Quebec?
It is. Let me just give a recent example. I noticed that your premier asked to be able to choose 100% of newcomers coming to his province through the provincial nominee program. I would like that same aspiration. We have been home to 57,000 evacuees from Ukraine. Many of them are using our provincial nominee program. And instead of increasing the amount of provincial nominees that we've asked for to 20,000, the federal government reduced them. So I think that's a violation, quite frankly, of Section 95 of the Constitution, which gives us concurrent jurisdiction. And we'll be pressing that. And perhaps Quebec would like to work with us on that.
Thank you very much. That is our time. Mr. Bachrach, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Premier Smith, for being with us. Maybe I'll pick up where my Bloc colleague just left off. You mentioned that Quebec is an inspiration to Alberta, and Quebec has taken a different approach to this whole issue of carbon pricing, the only province in Canada to be part of a cap and trade or a carbon market with, I believe, California and Washington. Is that something that Alberta has looked to participate in as an alternative to the federal backstop?
I think that we have our own program. If I understand the Quebec program, there's 172 industrial outfits that operate under their cap and trade system. I believe actually ours is more expansive. I'm not sure of the total number, but we did have large emitters that were under the program. We just recently reduced the threshold so that anyone who emits, I believe it's more than 2,000 megatons a year, can also participate in our emissions reduction program. So if they are able to do better than the average in their industry, they will generate credits. Those credits can then be sold so that they can turn it into a revenue stream. So yes, we've modeled our industrial program similarly to Quebec. At the moment, it is just internal to trade within Alberta, but it has been advocated to me that we should be looking at ways of expanding it.
So you would look like, for instance, if you participated in the same carbon market as Quebec, then this whole issue of the carbon tax wouldn't be an issue for Albertans. It's not an issue for Quebecers because they're part of a different system that they've signed up for. Are you currently looking at whether to participate in that same system?
No, we won't participate in that system because, quite frankly, we transfer enough money to Ottawa that then gets spent in equalization to Quebec. So we're not looking for another way of transferring dollars out of Alberta to Quebec. What we are interested in doing is finding ways of generating our own offsets through our investment in Dow Chemical, Petrochemical, which is net zero, Air Products, hydrogen, which is net zero, Heidelberg net zero cement. We also are keen to work with the federal government on establishing an ammonia market so that we would be able to reduce emissions internationally. Article 6 has been mentioned by previous premiers. If we could simply reduce China's reliance on coal by 20%, that would offset all of the emissions of all of Canada. We also have geothermal that we are investing in. We just launched our very first competitive hydrogen fueling station, and we'll be building out our hydrogen infrastructure. We've partnered with the federal government on dual fuel vehicles for long haul. We've partnered with the federal government on hydrogen buses. So those are the kind of ways that we want to generate our own credits that can be used to offset our emissions so that we can get to net zero by 2050. At some point, once that market is more developed, perhaps we would look at having those emissions credits traded more broadly, but at the moment we're keeping it as an internal market.
So you mentioned Article 6 and this idea that we can get some sort of credits for our exports, even when those products are consumed in other jurisdictions. And Canada does export some clean products. However, we also export some products that aren't so clean, including thermal coal. Should the impact of burning thermal coal in other jurisdictions also count against our domestic emissions?
Well, I can tell you we don't export thermal coal, as I understand. I think that's mostly British Columbia that does that.
I'm not saying Alberta, but I'm saying Canada, because of course Article 6 would apply on a national basis, I believe. Correct?
Well, you actually have the ability under Section 6.2 as a subnational government to also go and negotiate those kinds of partnerships. I can tell you how South Korea and Japan and India are looking at it. Since they do have a large coal fleet, they're looking at dual combustion. So if we can apply either hydrogen or ammonia so it can be combusted at the same time, that reduces the overall emissions profile. And if there's a way for us to export those products and then get joint credit, whether it's 50-50 or whether they take 80% and we take 20%, we think that that's good for the planet. We think that that would be the way that we would make the largest reduction in emissions globally.
But I guess my question still stands. Should we not also be, should our exports of dirty products also be accounted for in the same way that our export of clean products are?
Look, it's a global market and it's a global problem, and we have to reduce global emissions. And the way I look at it is that if we can live up to the spirit of what we signed on to in COP28, which recognizes natural gas as a transition fuel, a vitally important transition fuel, then we'll be able to reduce the overall global emissions profile. I can tell you what countries like South Korea and Japan and others tell us is that if they can't get those long-term supplies of things like LNG or ammonia, then they're just going to have more unabated coal that they bring on stream, which will actually increase overall emissions. So I would say that if we, in the spirit of looking at this as a global problem, understanding that there are interim measures that need to be taken, it seems to me that those are the kind of things that we should be partnering with our friends and allies on.
So you mentioned COP28 and the Paris Agreement. Do you support Canada remaining in the Paris Agreement?
Yes.
And the Paris Agreement predominantly is focused on reducing domestic emissions. You mentioned Article 6, but at this point, Article 6 hasn't been used to provide credits for the export of energy products from our country. The largest part of the Paris Agreement is reducing domestic emissions. And in that challenge, we have a plan put forward by the government that you take issue with. Have you tabled an alternative proposal, as the Prime Minister has suggested, that would contribute to meeting the requirements of the Paris Agreement?
Yes.
Very brief answer. I apologize, Premier.
Sure. My very first conversation with the Prime Minister was to tell him we were aligning with a 2050 target like our allies, and that I would produce an emissions reduction and energy development plan, which I did last April. And we've been working on a number of tables for how we will work on achieving some of those interim steps.
Thank you, Premier.
Thank you very much. Ms. Goodridge, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Premier for taking your time here today to stand up for Albertans. We've seen now the country, Germany, Japan, and most recently Greece come asking the Prime Minister about LNG, and unfortunately his answer every single time seems to be there's no business case. I don't think he's correct. Can you give a bit of a snapshot as to what LNG would mean for our province?
I can tell you what it would mean for our country, what it would mean for our partner, British Columbia, as well, what it would mean for First Nations, who are increasingly developing LNG export facilities. We've been very supportive of our Indigenous communities being able to develop resources, take an equity stake, and be able to generate income. So, for instance, we have a $3 billion Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation. I see that British Columbia has also established a $1 billion loan guarantee to allow nations to buy equity stakes in a variety of different projects. So, for instance, there's a 900 megawatt Cascades power plant that is Indigenous owned. We've got pipeline networks that are Indigenous owned. And so I'm very much looking forward to seeing the impact that will have. It's going to deliver $1.2 billion worth of revenue to our nations in Alberta. And I would encourage every province to do the same, as well as the national government to do the same. The value of natural gas right now is very low. It's $1.72 per gigajoule, as I was mentioning, but it becomes the base fuel for so many products that can be used in the transition. LNG and ammonia are the most stable ways to transport the hydrogen molecule. And so being able to do both of those, I think, opens up new markets as well as reduces emissions. We developed our Alberta Petrochemical Incentive Program, where we give a 12% rebate for anyone who uses natural gas as a feedstock fuel. It's part of the reason why Dow Chemical and Air Products have located in our industrial heartland. I should also mention that when we have done a survey of our pore space, we have the best pore space in the world for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, second only to Russia. And that is part of the reason, because we have an at-scale project that was done by Shell Quest, and we have an at-scale project for the carbon trunk line. We're immediately able to capture those CO2 emissions. The pore space we have, I'm told by my officials, is so large it could theoretically capture all of the emissions already produced by man so far. So we are very keen to make sure that natural gas, in the spirit of COP28, remains that transition fuel. So not only we can help ourselves, our Indigenous partners, the Canadian economy, but also our international partners.
Thank you for that, Premier. So speaking of natural gas, we did see this winter a carve out for Atlantic Canadians on their home heating, but not for natural gas, which is how most of us here in Alberta heat their homes. Do you think that's fair?
Not fair at all. In fact, when you look at how it's December, January, February, and March that we have the greatest need for natural gas. I noticed there's members on the committee from Ontario. Ontario also relies on natural gas principally for home heating. And most people would have been able to enjoy a break during this winter because natural gas is trading so low. But when you layer on a carbon tax that is twice the amount that people are paying for their base fuel, and it's itemized on our home heating bills, we see it, we feel it, especially since we know that home heating oil is about 1.25 times more intensive on CO2 emissions. To see that anyone who is using home heating oil with a higher emissions profile is able to get a 3-year break while we're suffering through the minus 35-degree winters that we often have, it's absolutely not fair. And I do think it is the obligation of the members of Parliament to ensure that fairness in application of federal policy applies to all products in all regions for all types of uses, and that's not happening.
Yeah, I know it's truly unfortunate how asymmetrical the approach from the federal government has been on so many of these issues. The solution that the Prime Minister and his eco-activist minister brought forward were heat